Chapter 3, we're back. A lot of technical terms in this chapter, try not to get too confused, go over the terms, repeat them, and practice with someone, and you'll be able to understand some of these brain terms. So this chapter is going to go over not just the anatomy, but how you actually can study the brain, techniques. Chapter will conclude on that. So we can get through this. Let's first understand that you have a CNS, central nervous system, and a PNS, peripheral nervous system. And you notice the CNS makes up the brain and the spinal cord. PNS makes up the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So central, brain and spinal, peripheral, outside of the brain and spinal. So overall, there's a nervous system, but the CNS and PNS are further broken down, and here it describes that for you. In terms of directions, facing that way, front, top, bottom, this is on the side, so this is looking at the head from the side. If you make a cut this way, that means you now look at all the brain areas from this side. That's called a coronal plane or coronal section. If you made a cut from here all the way back and look at the brain areas from top down, that'd be a horizontal plane. If you cut from nose to the back of the head, look at all the areas to the side, that'd be a sagittal section. So down here it explains what those areas would be, how the brain is cut. Horizontal, looking top down. Sagittal, looking from the side. Coronal, everything from the front. Also, in terms of descriptions, anything that's dorsal, D-O-R-S-A-L, means top. Ventral means bottom. Lateral means the side. Medial, middle. So the reference points to directions are also how we describe the brain. You can look at some reference points to directions here. There's terms that we didn't just talk about, but ipsilateral, contralateral. Ipsi just means the same side of the body. Contralateral means crossing over opposite side of the body. For the nervous system, you have in your brain, when you say gray matter, you're speaking about cell bodies. You see white matter, you're thinking about tracts and fibers that travel to other parts of the brain. So dark matter, gray matter. Somebody says you don't have any gray matter between your ears, take that as an insult, because that's where the thinking capacity is for the brain to work right. So this chart right here just breaks down what the nucleus is versus the tract versus the gyrus, sulcus, and we'll talk about those terms when we go with the cortex later on. So overall, the brain itself is the global command center. Then you got the spinal cord that then goes to as an interconnecting site to talk to the muscles and other parts of the body. So brain and spinal cord become key and critical. Without them, again, a person really is not in existence. With the spinal cord, think about if that was my spinal cord on the board, the top of my body, the back of my body is up top right here, dorsal. The bottom part is underneath. So if you make a cross section between the spinal cord, look at the top. All information in your body that goes into the spinal cord goes over the dorsal root. All information that leaves it goes over the bottom part of the spinal cord. The Bell-McGinley law. Everything should go over and come out. Same way. So where you see that gray matter, those are cell bodies. And then we talked about in chapter 1, I believe, of nerve cell, I said there's motor neurons, sensory neuron, and interneuron. This is where you find those interneurons. The white matter is where the tracks, the fibers that are going to other parts of the body. This describes that for you here. Colored image showing what we just discussed. So the peripheral nervous system has this system called the autonomic nervous system. Make sure you know the difference between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system. These happen automatically, automatic, it almost sounds like that. Here's a description of how it's broken down. It's interesting that the parasympathetic nervous system comes out of the top and bottom part of your spinal cord. The sympathetic nervous system comes from the middle part of your spinal cord. So one's called the craniosacral division, one's called the thoracolumbar division. Point is, they come from different parts of the spinal cord to not alter, but to control and manipulate your internal organs. Stomach, heart, lungs, breathing, all those things are maintained without you paying attention to it. And so the blue here shows it from the top and bottom. The red here shows it coming from the middle. So the top goes as a long axon that gives to the body part and a short one. The sympathetic has a short one going through a chain right here, a sympathetic chain, and then it goes to the organ. So they're structured differently to control the quick pace of, or the slow pace of what needs to happen in the body. So think of the sympathetic nervous system as the energy promoting system, the parasympathetic as the energy conserving system. And again, review that here. And so there's different chemicals like acetylcholine and norepinephrine that come out of different parts of the chain, different parts of the system to kind of slow down or speed up the way that the heart functions. Some people have panic attacks. The heart is racing real fast. Breathing is real intense. And so these things can happen automatically without you understanding why it's happening. Why it's happening. I'm going to go through this quickly because you have access to going back on your own to review this. So, when you break down the brain and look at lower animals compared to us, and you kind of look at divisions, you have a hindbrain, a midbrain, and a forebrain. Hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. So most lower animals have the hindbrain. So if you looked at the brain, there's a sagittal section of the brain. Again, the side section. This hindbrain is the bottom part. Midbrain is there in the middle. Forebrain is everything else. So, hindbrain, midbrain, forebrain. So this is just describing the areas that are in those locations. Hindbrain makes up the medulla, pons, and the cerebellum. Medulla is the place for vital functions, heart rate, breathing, swallowing, eating. Pons, a group of cell or tracts underneath the brain that make the information go from one side to the other. Cerebellum, important for, it's on the back of the head. Cerebellum, if you see it on the, here's the head, and the back side is the cerebellum, which I didn't take out. Cerebellum itself is for fine coordinated movements. And also memory. And some studies have shown that it's got to do something. It's got 70 billion neurons. It's got to be more than just fine coordinated movement or just memory, but it's very important for brain function. So, fish brain, hindbrain discusses what they are. The brain stem is just like, like think about ice cream cone, the cone part. Brain stem, the cone part of the ice cream cone. Going up here to this area that's like pink is like the tracks, the pathways that are coming across from left to right. All these little orange things that are coming off, those are called cranial nerves. Your notes, it's in your notes, you have 12 pairs of cranial nerve, and you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So in your notes, brain stem, the medulla, I mean, those are vital areas. You think about it, those vital areas were at the top of your forehead, you just about a temple and knock them out. If they were right here in the top of the head, you knock them out. But the vital areas are deep in and protected, so you just can't knock somebody out. Midbrain, so hindbrain, midbrain, and anything that's going beyond that is the forebrain. So the midbrain, and we'll go over that with another slide, but the two little bumps here, again, this is the front, this is the back part of the head. We're showing it from this angle here. So the eyes are up over here. So these two little bumps, the first bump is called the superior colliculus. Second bump is called the inferior colliculus. The superior colliculus is important for like keeping things in orientation with vision. You see a bird flying across the sky? Helps keep that in orientation. Inferior is for hearing. If you hear a sound, what side of the room or where did that sound come from? Localization. So superior and inferior colliculus help to process sensations like vision and hearing. At the bottom of that midbrain is called the tegmentum. So the roof of the midbrain is called the tectum. The floor is called the tegmentum. So roof, tectum, floor, tegmentum. So this makes up the midbrain. And there's some cells inside the midbrain. So that same image we just saw, the roof, the floor, inside, you got some cells. This group is called the red nucleus. They're considered to be mirror neurons. M-I-R-R-O-R, mirror, like seeing in a mirror. If those cells are lit up, or they're lit up when someone's thinking about doing a task, like a baby sees you smiling and they smile, or asks you, can you moonwalk? What's the first thing you think about moonwalking? Perhaps maybe Michael Jackson, and what slides through on the floor. So the mirror neurons light up when you're thinking about doing that. And then these other areas, this other area, substantia nigra, these are the other cells. We'll see those cells again when we deal with movement. But the point is that even though the midbrain is a very small area, it has some very important cells. Roof, tectum, floor, tegmentum. This tegmentum area actually goes to the forebrain, and this is the beginning site for this whole reinforcement process of people who are caught up in drugs and addiction and the repetitive feelings. This is where this kind of addictive process starts, from the tegmentum to the forebrain, called the nucleus accumbens. We'll see that later on. So hindbrain again, and we talked about cranial nerves, there's 12 pairs of them. I won't ask you to memorize them, but again, the first one, olfactory, second one, optic, third, oculomotor, and I can make you remember all 12 cranial nerves in a matter of 2 minutes, but we won't have time for that. You can do it on your own. In the classroom, we'll focus on that. But right now, again, 12 pairs of cranial nerves, controlling the eyes, tongue, hearing, smell, all those things that your head is involved in. And this chart tells you what they do. Again, the hindbrain and the pons, cerebellum, further explanation of the midbrain, which we just went over. Here's a side section, if you can remember some of these areas in the brain from a sagittal sections, very good. Again, brain stem, coming from the spinal cord. There's your pons, there's your medulla. That little blue area there is the midbrain. You got a roof, you got a floor. And in this other area, now we haven't talked about, all this is then forebrain. The whole cortex. This area right in the dead center, like a little eye that's right in the middle of the head. It's the thalamus. Right below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Hypo what? Meaning below. Below the thalamus. So thalamus, hypothalamus, and then there's the pituitary gland. We saw those last chapter. But here we are talking about a sequence of events that can really trigger, it can release chemicals and alter your emotions, your behavior. Right here, this area that's kind of separating the two hemispheres. That right there is this right here. It's called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum. This helps to connect the left side and the right side of the brain. It's a bridge. That's why it's white matter. It's not neurons. It's not gray matter. It's white matter. So again, the forebrain and all those other areas, you can review that here. Some specific ones we'll speak about, what we do later. So if we got the brain, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, you got a split down the middle, so you can see there's a cut. Any deep cut in the brain is called a fissure, F-I-S-S-U-R-E. If it's a slight cut, called a sulcus. Here's a fissure. Here is a small cut, sulcus. And that becomes important because the brain is the same color all the way through, except for our jaw, which has different color. But you would not know unless you know landmarks. So here we have the longitudinal fissure. You look at the side of the brain, this thing could be, this is another fissure also, because that's a pretty deep groove. But then a sulcus could be something right up here. Sulcus could be right here, a dividing line. And it becomes important when we start talking about functions of the hemispheres. So these areas that have a black space in it, those are called ventricles. Ventricles are like cavities, like caves, like holes. Well, in the caves, in these cavities, in these holes, is something called cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. So the cerebrospinal fluid flows through the brain. It also flows around the brain. The particular chemical or the particular structures that produce that cerebrospinal fluid are called choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is in certain locations of the brain, but it helps produce the CSF, which is actually almost like saline solution, like water flowing. The ventricles make up the ventricular system. There'll be another slide showing that, so I'll come back to that. So, for the forebrain, there are a collection of neurons or cells that can function together to act and control your emotions. So, limbic system. is the system controlling your emotions. So all those four brain structures, when you collectively put some together, they make up the forebrain. They make up, some of them collectively make up the limbic system for emotions. The big olfactory bulbs, hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, the cerebral cortex, and the cingulate gyrus is right above the corpus callosum. All those connected together. Any disruption in there somewhere could impact the person's emotions. So there's a colored image of the brain. You have the brain like this, and you open it up and look inside. The little blue area there is the amygdala, that pink area that it's sitting on top of. It's called the hippocampus. So hippocampus is for memory, amygdala is for fear and aggression. So both of them impact how you're going to respond to something. In yellow there, the olfactory bulbs for smell. Smelling has a real impact on how you deal with your emotions. Certain perfumes, colognes, or certain smells, like even for a dog or a cat, they can smell fear. So that big pink thing there is the gyrus right above the corpus callosum. So I showed you the corpus callosum earlier. It's that white area there. Cingulate gyrus is the gyrus right above it. So that's what this is, cingulate gyrus. So all that connected impacts your emotions. The hypothalamus and the thalamus, in your notes, remember the hypothalamus as the regulator. Remember the thalamus as your integrator. I say regulator because it helps to regulate, let's say, temperature. You have a thermostat in the room, the thermostat regulates it's going to be hot or cold in the room. Integrator, the thalamus is there dead in the center of the brain because it has all these cells that go through it. And if you have a memory of some apple pie, the last time you had it, it was at the park somewhere, something happened outside, and how do you relate apple pie to a park? It's an event that occurred there because the thalamus is integrating that information with your senses that can range from, again, smelling, tasting, and hearing. So the pituitary gland is also something that's very important. Pituitary gland is, again, not just one gland, it's two portions of it, the anterior and posterior. However, when we talk about the basal ganglia, it is multiple structures together. And those multiple structures could be the caudate nucleus, substantia nigra, putamen, globus pallidus, and how they work together. So limbic system is for emotions, the basal ganglia is for movement. Helps to regulate movement. And if you look at the brain, same way we do the limbic system. Here you have the brain, you open it up. In the middle there is the thalamus. You got the globus pallidus deep there in the center. You got the caudate nucleus connected to the substantia nigra, amygdala, putamen. Collectively, these are involved in regulating your movement. Forebrain. So again, more structures. So even if it's saying forebrain, you think it's just the frontal part of your head, forehead. No, it's really everything that's beyond hindbrain and midbrain. Hippocampus, memory storage, located on the side of the brain. Looks like a seahorse, so it's a Greek word for a seahorse. Ventricles, we talked about that already. And here's a picture of, in blue, again, here's the head, open it up. That blue is showing like water, like a flow of energy, not energy, but chemicals. So it helps transport waste, it helps to send chemicals to other parts of the brain, and acts as a cushion. It's not just here in the brain, it's also bathing the brain. If you look at a real brain and you cut it open, you see a cavity. Like if you had a cavity in your tooth, it's a hole in your tooth. There's a hole in the brain. So you got from the spinal cord up to the fourth ventricle. Yeah. Well, first of all, lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, spinal cord, around. Lateral ventricle, third ventricle, fourth ventricle, spinal cord, around. So it circulates. It doesn't stay stagnant. But listen to this. So there's a covering of the brain to keep that fluid in. So the covering of the brain is like saran wrap, if I put it around this brain right here. Keeps the fluid flowing around, and the fluid is flowing also inside the brain. So the meninges is the covering. If it becomes inflamed, you got an itis. What kind of itis? Meningitis. So the membranes that surround the brain help to protect. If they become inflamed, you get meningitis. Not a good thing, because you don't want your brain getting. We talked about that blood-brain barrier to keep out chemicals, bad things. Well, this is what happens if there's chemicals or bad things do get to the brain. You have some swollen blood vessels and cause some real problems. Not lastly, but as we deal with the cortex, it is actually, cortex is or bark, it's the bark of a tree. Think about that. It's the outside covering. And then if you actually open up the brain, so the cortex is really just the outside covering. Cortex is the outside. This white part is what tracks. So even though we're saying that this whole brain looks like it's all gray and cortex goes deep, it's really just a covering on the outside that we're calling the cortex. So your brain, or your head, has two hemispheres, left hemisphere, right hemisphere. They're connected by what? Corpus callosum. When you look at a hemisphere, there's a left and right, have two different roles to play in terms of assisting with your behavior. Left hemisphere is usually associated with things like linear skills, logical thinking, mathematics, reasoning. The right brain is usually associated with artistic skills, creativity, emotions. So given that, not necessarily say they're totally structurally different, but there is some connections that make them different. So that layer that I told you about, that we're saying is the cortex, this little pink layer here, it's actually 6 layers. 1 to 6. Those 6 layers have different types of cells in each layer. Here you see pyramidal cells, down here you see spindle cells. So different layers of cells are in that area there that we're saying is the cortex. So beyond saying left hemisphere, right hemisphere, you have 4 lobes to the brain. Occipital, parietal, temporal, and frontal lobe. And I give you a thing link on your canvas to look at the breakdown of what each one of those do. So in short, frontal lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital, and you see what they do. So here vision, here it says hearing and also visual processing. Here you get frontal lobe, intellectual reasoning, planning, parietal lobe, sensory system, and back of the head, vision. So where you see the dividing lines in color from green to yellow, that's the central sulcus. So in your notes, make sure you remember that central sulcus is the dividing line between the frontal and parietal lobe. In front of the central sulcus, again, you can look at it on your own, but it's the primary motor cortex. Behind the central sulcus is the primary sensory cortex. Primary motor, primary sensory. So sensory, parietal, motor, and frontal lobe. Again, occipital, parietal. When we deal with the parietal and the frontal lobe, there's a way that the body is actually represented on the cortex. See that cortex, that outside area we just showed you on the model? The way the body is represented is called a homunculus. So your body is topographically organized into a homunculus on the brain. So it's not like a simple layout of from your feet, trunk up to your head. It's laid out where it's a portion of the brain and how important it is to have amount of that brain area to serve that function. So here we have the arm, kind of covers a whole lot of brain area. You got your tongue, even though it's small in the arm, still covers a lot of brain area. You got your whole face right here. So the homunculus describes how your body is represented onto the cortex. So again, the lobes are described. You can read that on your own. You can look at other animals in that prefrontal cortex. Look at ours as humans. We have more blue space because there's more cells down with our prefrontal lobes, making us able to maybe pontificate, think about God and religion and more grander things. So that frontal lobe is what gives us maybe the creativity we have to build. So this is discussing again the prefrontal lobe. And you can skip this part, but the next area on research methods, know a little bit about this because we're talking about how do you study this? How do you know about the brain? CAT scans, MRIs, PET scans. What does all that mean? Some of you may have had that before. So when we talk about recording brain activity, you heard of EEG. Well, EEG is not an EKG. EKG is electrocardiogram. EEG is electroencephalogram. So to measure electrical activity in the brain. So brain damage can be a result, a car accident. If you ever seen a movie Concussion about football, I mean, that really shows about what happens to the brain over long term. CTEs, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. I mean, the brain constantly getting hit, it starts to deteriorate and start losing memory. Well, there are ways that you can study this rather than just waiting for a person or something, an accident to happen. No, these people have been funded for research to study, took out brain areas where you injected something into it, what would happen to the body. So research has been shown to do that. So there's something called a stereotactic instrument, where you can lock a person's head into, or an animal's head into an instrument that then has coordinates that you can then go down to a certain area of the brain and do surgery. So here's one for an animal, not a human, but you put the animal's ears into the bars here, nose clamp there, and this instrumentation right here allows you to use like a lever system to put electrode down into the brain. That's what a stereotactic instrument is. And again, same thing can be done with humans. Something called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. Yeah, you can use a magnet to influence a person's behavior. It's pretty interesting. Pretty powerful. You think about people with cell phones by their heads, and you think about things that can be done from a distance, pulsing magnetic energy and cause people to do strange things. So here we're just talking about how you can use it for medicinal purposes. And yet you've been trained as an MD to even be able to do TMS. Example of it right there. You can actually stimulate the brain. Many studies have been done with animals over the years, but they don't think about brain stimulation in humans. But people with Parkinson's disease, shaking, they can now have some apparatus that they can put on their body, push the button, it causes some stimulation to the brain that causes those tremors to go away. So it can happen like that. There's techniques that can be used in small animals where you can actually turn on and activate neurons using a laser light because you've activated certain molecular mechanisms. EEG talked about that. Electrical activity in the brain, that's not invasive, that's just put an electrode on the outside of the head and measure that. Example, right there. PET scan or magnetic encephalograph or PET scan, that's the one that's invasive because you can actually put a radioactive dye into the bloodstream, let's say for dopamine, and then that dopamine is measured on the scan. So radioactive dye injected to what produce an image of where that is in the brain. So this is a PET scanner. Again, PET stands for positron emission tomography, PET, positron emission tomography, invasive. However, there's something called the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. So for scans, now there's something called a CAT scan, CAT, computerized axial tomography. Remember that. Again, not invasive, just like an X-ray. Versus the MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, it's able to look at like a 3D image of a brain part. So it's more detailed. So you may have an MRI on your knee, on your back, rather than just your head, because it sees where a tumor is and its location, size, versus the X-ray just gives you a straight black and white image of a one-dimensional view. So MRI, you have to be put into a cylindrical column. It's like a magnets that are resonating onto a brain or body part, and then the image then comes out on a scan. So early on, people used to use something called phrenology. Don't even talk about that anymore. Phrenology is like people say, oh, well, happiness is located right here. Sadness is right here. Fortitude over here. Putting brain, characteristics, personality characteristics of brain structure, but that's not how it works anymore. So that's the phrenology map. So that's just showing you the history of what people have done in the past. But today, we have, again, these more useful techniques. And there's a chart at the end of this that gives you a synopsis of what all this means, and you can study that, and you'll be set for this chapter on anatomy and research methods. Okay? Study hard.